The envelope sat on her kitchen counter for 3 days before she opened it. Not because she forgot about it, not because she was busy, but because some part of her already knew that whatever was inside would require her to make a choice she wasn't ready to make. The morning she finally tore it open, her hands were steady. Her breathing was not. What she found inside wasn't a letter. It wasn't money. It was something small and ordinary that most people would have thrown away without a second thought. But she held it like it was made of glass, and she stood at that counter for a long time, very still, while the coffee she'd poured went cold beside her. By the time you hear the whole story, you'll understand why that little thing meant everything. You'll understand what it cost him to leave it. And you'll understand why she got in her car and drove 40 miles through a Mississippi rainstorm to find a man who had just walked away from more money than most people see in a lifetime. Stay with me. Her name was Dominique Elaine Marsh, and she had learned early that being rich was its own kind of loneliness. Not the kind people felt sorry for, the kind nobody talked about because it didn't look like loneliness from the outside. From the outside, it looked like a restored Victorian house on the edge of Clover Hill, Mississippi, with original hardwood floors and a wraparound porch that caught the breeze off the creek in the evenings. It looked like a navy blue Land Rover that always smelled faintly of leather and the vanilla candles she burned in every room. It looked like a woman who had it together. Dominique, 34 years old, natural hair usually pinned up with a tortoiseshell clip, reading glasses perpetually pushed to the top of her head, ran the town's only estate law firm out of a converted carriage house behind the main square. She'd built it herself after passing the bar on her first try. She drove herself to work, she made her own coffee, she paid her own bills and her mother's electric and her younger brother's tuition at Ole Miss. She was not waiting to be saved. She had never waited for anything in her life. But there were two things she did not talk about at her weekly brunches with her girlfriends. Two things she kept in a small locked drawer inside herself, behind the competence and the pressed blazers and the easy laugh. The first was Marcus. Marcus had been charming and attentive right up until the point where it became clear that Dominique's name on the firm's letterhead was more attractive to him than Dominique herself. She'd caught him on the phone with his brother, voice low and satisfied, saying, "Yeah, she's the real deal. Firm, property, the whole thing." She hadn't cried. She'd just handed him his jacket from the hook by her door and asked him to leave. He'd acted confused, like she'd misunderstood something. She had not misunderstood anything. The second was Terrence. Terrence had come 2 years later and felt safer because he had his own money, his own business, his own ambition. He didn't need hers. But what she hadn't accounted for was that Terrence needed an audience, and Dominique was too self-contained to be one. He left for a woman who clapped for everything he said. Dominique told herself that was fine, that it was better, that she preferred quiet to performance. What she told herself most mornings was that she was selective, discerning, that the right person would understand who she was without needing her to explain it or diminish it. What she avoided was the possibility that she had started building tests before people even had a chance to pass them. She avoided thinking about how she watched people just a little too closely now, how she listened for the wrong note in a sentence, how she had gotten very good at finding reasons. Her daily life reflected this. She worked long hours not entirely because the work demanded it. She kept her weekends structured. She went to church with her mother on Sundays and smiled through the questions about grandchildren and sat with the stillness of a woman who had made peace with a situation she had not actually made peace with. His name was Calvin Reese, and he had been fixing things since he was 9 years old. Not metaphorically, literally. He had taken apart the broken, oscillating fan in his grandmother's back bedroom in Clover Hill with a butter knife and a prayer and had gotten it running again. His grandmother, Miss Etta, had watched him do it and said, "Boy, you got good hands." He'd carried that with him. 31 years old now, medium build, the kind of quiet that wasn't shy but was intentional, Calvin worked as the head groundskeeper and general maintenance man for the Clover Hill Municipal Park and the 2 historic properties the town managed on behalf of the Mississippi Heritage Trust. He drove a 2009 Ford F-150 that he kept immaculate. He rented a small house on Birch Street, 2 bedrooms, a garden in the back where he grew tomatoes and collard greens, and one stubborn fig tree that had taken 4 years to produce anything. He tithed at church every Sunday, not because anyone was watching, but because Miss Etta had taught him that you gave first and trusted the arithmetic to work out. It usually did. Calvin had grown up with not much, but not without dignity. His mother had worked 2 jobs and kept the house clean and read to him every night until he could read himself. His father had not stayed, and Calvin had spent a long time being angry about that, and a longer time deciding not to carry it like a wound. He carried it instead like information. He would not be that. Whatever else happened, he would not be that. The virtues he had were not the flashy kind. He remembered details people mentioned once in passing and followed up on them later. He did not leave a job half done. If he said he'd be somewhere at 7, he was there at 6:55. And he never, not once, talked badly about someone to make himself look better in comparison. In a small town where gossip moved like weather, that last one was rarer than people realized. He was conscious, always, of how he was perceived in certain spaces. He noticed when he walked into the town's one upscale restaurant for a plumber's estimate, and the hostess's eyes moved from his work boots to his face with a particular kind of recalibration. He noticed when people at the Heritage Trust board meetings spoke to him with the specific over-enunciation of people who assumed he needed help understanding things. He didn't get angry about it in the room. He would acknowledge it privately, in the truck, on the drive home, and then he would set it down. He was there to work. He was there to do good work. That was the thing that couldn't be taken from him. They met on a Wednesday in October, which was, as Dominique later told her friend Charisse, the most unremarkable day she could imagine for something to begin. She had been walking the back path of Clover Hill Municipal Park on her lunch break, a habit she'd developed to clear her head between morning briefs and afternoon client calls. She had her phone out, reading a case summary, not watching where she was going, and she walked directly into the wheelbarrow Calvin was pushing along the gravel path. Not hard enough to fall, hard enough to dump her phone into the pile of mulch in the barrow. She said, "Oh." He said, "My fault entirely," and reached in and retrieved the phone before she could, brushing the mulch off with a clean rag he pulled from his back pocket with the automatic efficiency of someone who always had what he needed. He handed it back. She checked the screen. Not cracked. "It's okay," she said. "I wasn't watching." "Neither was I," he said, which wasn't true, but it was kind. She noticed his hands, the clean rag, the way he'd said his fault without hesitation, without that male flinch toward self-justification she'd come to expect. She said, "What are you planting?" He looked at the mulch like it was an interesting question. "Nothing yet. Preparing the bed for the spring bulbs. You plant them in fall, they rest all winter, and come up in March like they were never gone." She didn't know why that sentence stayed with her on the walk back. She turned it over twice before she got to her car. What she left unresolved was his name. She'd walked away without asking. She went back the next Wednesday. He was there. That was how it started. Those Wednesday lunches became the rhythm of it. It wasn't deliberate at first. She told herself it was just a break, just fresh air. But she started timing her lunch differently, started taking the back path without pretending there was another reason. Calvin never made it into anything it wasn't. He didn't linger when she arrived or try to extend things past what they naturally were. He worked while they talked, which she found she liked enormously. It felt honest. She'd grown tired of men who stopped what they were doing to perform attention. She learned things in pieces, that he'd been reading James Baldwin since he was 17, that he made his grandmother's sweet potato pie every Thanksgiving from a handwritten recipe card that had a grease stain on the corner that he'd never tried to remove because it proved the recipe worked. That he had a younger sister in Memphis he called every Sunday after church. He learned things too. That she argued cases in her head while she walked, sometimes out loud, and she wasn't embarrassed when he caught her. That she had a soft spot for old things, old houses, old furniture, old ways of doing things, because they carried evidence of people caring enough to preserve something. That she laughed suddenly and completely when something was actually funny, not the social laugh, the real one, and it changed her whole face. She was lowering something. She could feel it. She wasn't sure she was ready. He brought her a tomato from his garden one Wednesday, wrapped in a cloth napkin, and handed it to her without ceremony, like it was nothing remarkable. She ate it that evening with salt and olive oil over her kitchen sink and felt something she couldn't name and didn't try to. Okay, I need to pause here for just a moment because this is the part of the story where I always want to ask you something. How many of you have been exactly where Dominique is right now, feeling something real, feeling it grow, and instead of leaning in, you start pulling back? Not because the person did anything wrong, but because the last person didn't have to do anything wrong and it still fell apart. Go ahead and drop that in the comments. I read every single one. And now let's get back to Dominique, because things are about to get complicated. It was the tomato that started it, which sounds absurd, but bear with me. She was at her desk on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Calvin had brought it, and she was reviewing a real estate transfer for a client when she came across a familiar name. A property assessment signed by a firm she recognized. And something about the way the numbers had been arranged reminded her, viscerally, of Marcus, of how he'd spoken to his brother, of how she had not seen it until she heard it with her own ears, because she had not been looking. The feeling that arrived in her chest was old and sharp. Not grief exactly, more like a warning light. She started thinking about what she actually knew about Calvin Reese. She knew what he'd told her. She knew what she'd observed. But she was a lawyer. She knew that the most convincing presentations were the ones most carefully curated. She knew that people showed you what served them. She started watching him differently on the next Wednesday. Not hostile, just attentive in a new way. She watched to see whether the consistency was real or whether it was a long game. She noticed whether he asked questions about the firm. He didn't. Whether he mentioned money, hers or his. He didn't. Whether there was a performance quality to his kindness, some awareness of audience. She couldn't find it, and somehow that made her more unsettled, not less. Because if she couldn't find it, maybe she wasn't looking in the right place. Maybe she needed to create a situation where it would reveal itself. She felt a little sick thinking it. She did it anyway. The test took her 2 weeks to set up, and she hated herself a little the whole time. The Clover Hill Heritage Trust was commissioning a restoration of the old Beaumont gazebo in the park, a cast iron and wood structure from 1887 that had fallen into disrepair. It was exactly the kind of project Calvin would be involved in. Dominique knew the trust's board chair, Eleanor Tate, socially. She made a call. She explained she was personally interested in sponsoring part of the restoration. Eleanor was pleased. The conversation turned, naturally, to who would be doing the work. Dominique said she'd heard good things about Calvin Reese. Eleanor confirmed he'd been assigned the project. The setup was this. Dominique arranged, through Eleanor, for a message to reach Calvin, not from Dominique, Calvin didn't know she was involved, that an anonymous donor was prepared to fund the full restoration and had specifically requested that the original cast iron railing design be replicated exactly, using hand-forged components, which was the correct and expensive and time-consuming way to do it. There was also an alternative, a cast aluminum replica that would look similar and cost roughly a quarter of the price, with the difference pocketed by the contractor as a standard substitution arrangement that happened all the time in heritage work. No one would know the difference from 20 feet. She positioned herself where she could observe the site on the first Monday of the project without being seen. She told herself she was just watching. She brought coffee. She sat in her Land Rover on the service road with the window cracked and watched Calvin Reese arrive at 7 in the morning with his toolbox and his measuring tape. He had a worn leather notebook with him. She'd seen it before, tucked in his back pocket. He opened it and wrote something. Then he walked the entire perimeter of the gazebo, slowly, touching the original railings, crouching down to look at the joinery at the base. He did this for 45 minutes. Then he made a phone call. She couldn't hear it, but she saw him pull up something on his phone, write more in the notebook, and then make another call. Later, she would learn he'd been calling a metal worker in Jackson who specialized in heritage ironwork. He chose the hand-forged components, the real ones, the right ones, the ones no one would have known weren't there if he'd substituted them. He ordered them that day. She saw him photograph the original railing with the kind of careful documentation of someone who intended to get it exactly right. She sat in her car afterward for a long time. He hadn't known anyone was watching. In the notebook's front cover, she would later see, he'd written in his grandmother's handwriting, "Do it right or don't do it." He'd kept it there for 11 years. That was the notebook. That was the symbolic object. And she didn't know yet what it meant, but something in her had gone very quiet. What happened next was her fault, and she knew it even as it was happening, Charisse told her. Not to cause trouble. Charisse didn't have that in her. But Charisse had been at the hardware store and had overheard Calvin talking to a man she didn't recognize, and the man had said something about that lawyer woman, and Calvin had smiled when he said it, and Charisse, who loved Dominique like a sister, had also heard the man say, "She's got that whole estate firm, that property on the hill," before she'd moved out of earshot. Dominique heard that, and the warning light that had been blinking quietly for weeks went solid red. She didn't call Calvin. She didn't confront him. She was not a woman who confronted. She withdrew. She rerouted her lunch walk. She stopped going on Wednesdays. She told herself this was the smart thing, the measured thing, the thing that protected her. She had seen enough. She had learned enough. This was the pattern, wasn't it? This was what they always were, eventually. She worked 14-hour days that week. She cleaned out a filing cabinet that didn't need cleaning. She called her mother twice and deflected every question with cheerful efficiency. She felt like a house that had closed all the windows before a storm. On the 4th day of silence, she walked past the park on an evening errand and saw the gazebo scaffolding in the fading light, and she did not look at it. She was very good at not looking at things. It was her brother Darnell who undid it. Darnell was 22 and studying engineering and had been back home for fall break, and he came into Dominique's kitchen on a Tuesday evening and sat at her counter and said, "You know that man Calvin who works at the park?" She kept her eyes on the cutting board. "I know who he is. He came by Mama's church Saturday, fixed the broken step on the side entrance. Wouldn't take any money. Mama tried to give him something, and he said he'd just seen it needed doing when he was there for service, and he had the materials in his truck." Dominique stopped cutting. "He didn't tell anybody," Darnell said. "The deacon saw him and told Mama after. That's the only reason anybody knows." She set the knife down. "He didn't even go inside," Darnell said. "He fixed it and left." She thought about Charisse's story. The man at the hardware store, that lawyer woman Calvin had, smiled. Maybe he was smiling because someone was talking about a woman he cared about. Maybe she had taken evidence and built a conviction without a trial. Her hands were still on the counter, very still. Her breathing had gone shallow. She was thinking about the gazebo, about 45 minutes of careful observation before a single decision, about a notebook with his grandmother's handwriting in the cover. She thought, what have I been doing? Not a question, a recognition. She drove to Birch Street the next morning at 7:15 before she could talk herself out of it. She sat in the truck in his driveway for a moment and then got out. He answered the door in a work shirt, coffee in hand, and his face did something careful and neutral when he saw her. Not cold, just measured, like a man who had learned not to show the cost of things right away. She said, "I owe you an explanation." He looked at her for a moment and then stepped back to let her in. They sat at his kitchen table with coffee, and she told him most of it. Not all of it. Not the test. She wasn't ready for that yet. But the withdrawal, the silence. She told him she had heard something and had assumed the worst and had run from it without talking to him. He listened without interrupting. That was both a grace and a pressure. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, turning his mug in his hands. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Yes." "I don't care about your firm," he said. "I don't care about the house on the hill. I have known what you have since probably the 3rd Wednesday, because this is Clover Hill and everybody knows everything, and it has never," he paused, "it has never been the interesting thing about you to me." She looked at her coffee. "But I need you to hear this too," he said, and his voice was still quiet, but it had something in it now that was serious. I have spent my whole life being looked at like I need to prove something, like the work isn't evidence enough, like I could do the right thing 100 times and one wrong look means it doesn't count. He paused. I can't be with someone who's waiting for me to slip. I won't do it. Not because I'm proud, I'm a little proud, but because that's not what love is supposed to feel like. Not for either of us. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You're right." He looked at her. "I know I'm right." She almost laughed. She did, a little. And something in the room shifted, just barely, towards something that might become okay. "I'm not asking you to trust me immediately," he said. "I'm asking you to be honest with me when you're scared. That's all." "I can try that," she said. "That's all I need," he said. It was 2 more weeks before her mother met him, and her mother did not ease into things. Bernice Marsh was 71 years old, small and precise, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the specific dignity of a black Southern woman who had built her life with no shortcuts and had opinions about everything and kept most of them quiet until she didn't. She met Calvin at Sunday dinner at Dominique's, which Dominique had told herself was just dinner and had known was not just dinner. Her mother sat across from Calvin and looked at him the way she looked at everything, thoroughly, without apology. She said, "What do you do?" He told her, "Groundskeeper, maintenance, Heritage Trust projects." She said, "You make good money at that?" "Mama," Dominique said. "Enough," Calvin said, without flinching, without elaborating. Just enough. As in, the question has been answered, and I'm not embarrassed by the answer, and I'm not going to perform humility or defensiveness for you. Bernice looked at him a moment longer. She said, "You know my daughter works very hard." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I do know that." "And you're not intimidated by it?" It wasn't quite a question. "No, ma'am," he said. "Her success doesn't shrink me. It doesn't have to." Bernice was quiet. Then she picked up her fork and served herself more sweet potato casserole, which, in Bernice Marsh's vocabulary, was the highest form of approval she was likely to offer at a first dinner. Dominique caught her mother's eye across the table, and her mother gave her a very small nod, the kind that meant, "This one's different." She told him about the test on a Sunday evening in November, sitting on her porch. She didn't plan it. She'd been carrying it for weeks like a splinter, and it finally just came out. She told him everything: the Heritage Trust call, the message about the components, the Land Rover on the service road, the watching. He was quiet for a long time after. She said, "I know it was wrong. I know it was." "No," he said. He was looking at the yard, the last of the evening light on the fig tree. "No, I think." He stopped, started again. "You showed me something you were afraid to show me. You just did it sideways." She frowned. "I manipulated a situation to test you." "You needed to know if I was real," he said. "You just didn't know how to ask directly." He turned and looked at her. "That's something we can work on. But you trusted what you saw. That part, that I respect." He reached into his jacket pocket and set his notebook on the rail between them. She looked at it. "You saw me with that the first day," he said. "You didn't know what was in it. But you watched me do the right thing anyway, and you remembered it." She looked at the notebook for a long moment. "The test," she said quietly, "told me more about what I'd been doing to myself than it told me about you." He picked up the notebook and put it back in his pocket. "Yeah," he said. "I figured." The gazebo restoration took 4 months. Calvin had started it before any of this, and Dominique found herself drawn to the site in a way she hadn't expected. She started coming by on Saturday mornings, not to watch, just to be near. She brought coffee. She sat on a folding chair and read briefs while he worked. He didn't narrate the work for her or explain what he was doing in the teaching voice people used when they wanted to seem competent. He just worked, and if she asked a question, he answered it plainly. The hand-forged railings arrived from Jackson in January, wrapped in cloth, and she watched him unwrap them with the same careful attention he gave everything. He ran his hand along the scroll work, compared it to his photographs of the original, measured twice. "It's right," he said. In February, on a cold Saturday morning, he let her help hold the first railing section while he positioned the bolts. Her hands were cold, and her coffee was on the ground, and she was not dressed for this at all. and she was happier than she had been in years. Small, specific, physical happiness. She held the railing steady while he worked, and he said, "Little to the left," and she moved it. And he said, "Perfect," and the bolt went in, and that was all that was. But it was something. She told him she loved him for the first time in his kitchen on a Tuesday in March, which was the least romantic possible circumstance. She was sitting at his table eating leftover soup he'd heated up because